sorry. Okay. Good afternoon. Very distinguished ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon to you all. I am particularly pleased to be starting, even though with apologies, a couple of minutes behind, because we're waiting for a few of our panelists to join us, but I am thrilled that we can start. Let me welcome in a very special way Engineer Mansour Ahmed, who's president of the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, and with whom I've had the distinct privilege and pleasure of interacting for more than 2 decades, engaged very often on issues of how to uplift the common good of all in Nigeria. Engineer Ahmed comes to this conversation with a deep experience in several sectors of our country's economy and a lot of activity, engagement with civil society effort through the Nigerian Economic Summit Group and so on and so forth, to help create and build an enabling environment for people's quality of life to be enhanced, for our country to thrive and to prosper. Joining me alongside Engineer Ahmed is a gentleman who is caught right now in the middle of a ceremony in Freetown in Sierra Leone. Dr. Kande Yunkela was, for a couple of years, a representative in Nigeria of UNIDO, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and eventually became Director General of UNIDO, the very first Black person to hold that position, from which he has since retired and was candidate for president of Sierra Leone in the last elections. He is very actively engaged in Sierra Leone at this time, and as it happened, as a sudden death of a vice president of Sierra Leone, and his funeral is going on as we speak. Dr. Yunkela is at that funeral ceremony and hopes to be able to join us in about 40 minutes or so when he can disengage from that activity. We are also expecting to join us Chief Kola Jamodu. Chief Jamodu was Engineer Ahmed's predecessor in the role of President of MAN. Chief Jamodu also served as Minister for Industries. And an interesting coincidence about today is that Chief Jamodu, while he was serving as Minister of Industries, was invited on a trip to Malaysia, which was sponsored by UNIDO, so that Nigeria could maybe engage some in the advance of Malaysian industry. And Chief Jamodu, myself, at that time, for reasons of perception as being the local country expert on Southeast Asia, I was invited also to come along that trip to Malaysia. And Kande Yumkela was with us on that trip. So it's an interesting agglomeration of this conversation. But let us get started. This conversation can be held by our interrogation of Engineer Mansour Ahmed alone. So we think that as the others join us, we will expand the pool that we add to this conversation. But let me, for purposes of those who have not been with us on previous journeys in the Nigeria History series, remind us of what the purpose is. Our country has had starts and stops in many policy arenas. It's our desire that the next generation of leaders, public, private, and civil society, become acquainted with choices that we have made as a country, why some things worked, why some things did not work, and to take advantage of this learning to ensure that we don't make the mistake that George Santayana warned us about, which says that those who do not know their history are likely to repeat his mistakes. So this is really a coaching program, a coaching exercise for all of our young people. And part of what has happened in the pursuit of getting many more young people to join us in this conversation is that we have engaged some of our telecom firms to say a lot of young people who want to join us find that these conversations, which take place fortnightly, sometimes run for 2.5 hours, and that it costs them a lot in terms of data. One of the things that we are doing today is that in partnership with Airtel Nigeria, we're going to have young people who register get a chance to win bundles of data, which will enable them to be able to be continually available to participate in this program for the next year or so. It will be enough data to serve them for 3 hours every week or thereabouts. And so we are very, very pleased to announce that the, if you will, contest for these bundles of data, which will go for quite a number of people, several hundred, I think, in the end, that we start today to bring in more young people. We have had some really interesting and robust conversations, but we found that more of the people who have followed us on Zoom, some younger ones follow us on Facebook and as we're streaming live, but more of those who have joined us directly on Zoom, who can then participate in our Q&A session, have been people who can better afford the data that is required for this engagement. So we're hoping that with this partnership with Airtel, we can get many more young people to participate so that all can learn and not repeat the mistakes of the past as we make progress. So in kickstarting today's conversation, in which we are really generally focused on strategy, on industrial policy, and how we can build the value chains that can sustain superior performance for manufacturing in Nigeria. I'd like to quickly take advantage of Engineer Mansour's own immediate engagement in the Dangote Group to ask of him to help us understand what happened that led us from being a significant cement importing country. A good part of our country's history cannot be written unless we interrogate the relationship between cement and the development of the Nigerian economy. In my much younger days, and part of my friendship with somebody who was a guest on this series, the manufacturing part of it, 3 or 4 sessions back, Alhaji Bamanga Tukur began when, as a very young man, Alhaji Bamanga Tukur was managed, when I, as a young man, followed Alhaji Bamanga Tukur as Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian Ports Authority in the days that were referred to the days of a cement armada. Cement armada because Nigeria, with a new boost, jab in the arm from income from crude oil, wanted to expand infrastructure very rapidly. And so, so much cement was ordered to build housing estates, to build complexes like the Tafawa Balewa complex, and so on and so on. And so ships were bringing cement to Nigeria and stretched for miles into the Atlantic. And it became a scandal. One of our fine civil servants from that era, Alhaji Ibrahim Danchida, who I also had the good fortune of knowing and interviewing when I was working on my PhD thesis, I think was the fall guy because he was the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Defense at the time, and he was accused of approving of the building of so many barracks across the country that added to this cement armada. Well, Alhaji Bamanga Tukur superintended a part of organizing the Nigerian Ports Authority to respond to that trouble, and port expansion and all of that took place. But bottom line is that today, Nigeria is literally exporting cement. How did we accomplish this transition at a time when we generally say that manufacturing has been in decline? I recall that in one of the sessions we had, I made the point that sometime in the late 1970s, early 80s, I believe it was, Nigeria had reached nearly 13% of GDP from manufacturing, and that there was a time it fell to more or less 3% of GDP and began to inch back up. How did manufacturing achieve this remarkable turnaround with cement, and what can we learn from what has happened with cement in terms of how to organize manufacturing to become more competitive in other sectors? Engineer Mansour Ahmed.
Well, thank you very much, Prof. Let me first of all thank you immensely for inviting me to this conversation. And indeed, I'm really humbled not only to be in this conversation with you yourself. I think we do all accept that as far as the economic strategy and the process in Nigeria is concerned, you are the ultimate guru. But I'm also really humbled to be in this conversation with my boss and my predecessor, as you said, actually predecessor of my predecessors, Chief Kola Jomodu, who actually indeed is still holding my hands through the intransigence of the manufacturing sector. And also, of course, with Dr. Michela, whom I have known for many, many years when he was indeed, I think, representing UNIDO in Nigeria. So it is indeed an honor to participate in this discussion. Now, the question you raised, I think before we answer what has happened to the cement industry, we need to go back a little, perhaps to the early 70s. When I actually graduated, sometimes in 1972, and came back to Nigeria to join industry in 1973, I had the good fortune to start work in an industrial area in Kano called Bompai. It was indeed a major industrial hub in Kano. And believe me, when you approach that area, even from perhaps a kilometer away, the sound and the smells and the movement all clearly indicate to you that you are approaching a very robust, very active industrial area. And the industries in Kano were then largely based on processing of locally produced, basically agricultural materials, oil mills, textile mills, chocolate factories, a whole range of industries, including, by the way, breweries as well in Kano. And you could see clearly that this is a robust industrial area. And of course, the whole country then was, of course, going through a really sustained industrial growth, because what I described in Kano, I'm sure, was happening in many other capitals, in many other major towns. Obviously, in Lagos, in Enugu, in Ibadan, in all these areas. And I think what was happening then, and that was indeed when you said we reached a manufacturing contribution to GDP of between 13 and I think 20 and even 15%. And the real reason was that we adopted what some people perhaps did not recognize as a robust but sensible and meaningful. It's not import substitution, it's actually import defending kind of industry. We were taking raw materials that are grown locally by the local community, processing them and putting them back in the market, not necessarily always for export, but to feed our growing population. And that created a situation where the industries were also feeding the commercial sector, and therefore there's largely a relatively balanced industrial growth and industrial activity. But you said what has happened. Then, of course, the oil boom came, and we're awash with money. I think one former head of state said our problem was not money, but how to spend it. But unfortunately, we did not have a good strategy for spending it. Yes, indeed, we put a lot of money in some infrastructure, but to a large extent, we also invested in downstream industries. You recall the federal government and all the state governments also create a lot of downstream processing and packaging industries, actually displacing the private sector. Because of course, government investment came with very little internal controls, very little evaluation of the profitability of these businesses, but creating jobs all the same. And so we were actually perhaps driven off by this huge flows of funds and the creation of industries that actually were not in all cases commercially competitive. This is why sometime later in the decade, in fact, in the 80s and 90s, we had to go back and privatize all those industries, largely because at any rate, they were not created in a way that would make them competitive, commercially competitive and profitable. At one point, I think there are over 300 federal government enterprises that are consuming public funds and returning absolutely nil. Now that brings me, if you like, to the cement industry. Of course, at the beginning, we had some private sector cement activities, particularly the Lafarge Group had 2 plants, I think, in Shagamu and subsequently in Wekuru. But then the federal government also went into cement production. They created the Sokoto cement mill at the federal and state government. They created Benue Cement. They invested in other areas of the activity, all in the same mode, without due cognizance of the need to ensure that these investments are run competitively and profitably. And with the influx of funding, this also happened in all other areas. So not only did our manufacturing sector suffer because the private sector of it was crowded out through the heavy government investment. A large number of investments were made that are unprofitable and commercially unviable. And at the same time, the basic input sector, the agricultural sector, even the mineral sector, was also neglected because those industries now prefer to import their cheaper inputs than to actually invest downstream and create the inputs necessary to create the value chain, the integrated value chain that was required. And when, of course, in the mid-70s or late 70s, the cement armada came, as you correctly said, we saw what happened. We needed huge quantities of cement, and instead of handing over the cement companies, encouraging the private sector to invest and actually supply the requirements for these infrastructure projects, we depended on import. We opened up the import. To be honest, I think part of the justification for this was largely the view we received from the international financial institutions. And I make no apologies for saying this, that tended to or wanted to persuade us that it is not competitive to use your local raw materials because they are comparing our local productive capacity with established capacities outside the country without recognizing that there are inbuilt costs that have to be accepted for creating new industries in an economy. And until you are able to accept those inbuilt costs, of course, you are likely to be uncompetitive. And this is still what is happening to the Nigerian industry, but we'll come to that later. At any rate, coming back to the cement, this was what created a situation where even after the Armada, we had a cement industry that was probably producing less than 8 million tons per annum. When, of course, our demand has continued to increase and expand because of the oil money, both for infrastructure development, as well as for private investments in the building sector and the real estate sector. So we had a situation where we are almost dependent on import. Even for cement, I think at that time, we're importing probably something between 70 and 80% of our requirement. And then I think something happened. I must say here, I think a government came in, I think in the Obasanjo government came, and we began to rethink this idea, particularly for cement. And we encourage local producers who were at that time actually local suppliers, who were at that time actually importing. Dangote was a major importer of cement, and there are others like him. But I think the government then engaged them to say, look, you set up the cement factory. We will give you all the support you require to expand it and to supply local market. And that is how the Dangote group went into cement. First, I think they acquired the Benue cement, which was then producing just barely 1 million tons per annum of cement. And within a space of now 10, 15 years, we have seen what has happened. Dangote has moved their production from that 1.5 million tons to now something in the region of, in Nigeria, over 20 million tons per annum. And of course, other cement manufacturers came on in his footsteps. Those who have been there for many years also saw the need to expand. And now today, we are a net exporter of cement in the sense that we are indeed exporting cement, apart from the fact that he has also now begun to build cement companies in other countries in Africa. So the real, I believe, learning here is that our strategy for economic growth must, first of all, we must take a fresh view of it and decide not just in cement, but in other sectors where we have the capacity to create rapid growth, where we have the inputs to transform into the final finished product. And there are many areas in the food processing area, in SSS, of course, you highlighted, in the building sector, and in many other sectors of our economy. And we need to do that conscious of the fact that in order for us to build this capacity and to build the skills and the technology that is necessary to create this, there will be costs that will have to be incurred in terms of the fact that you cannot start a business today. You cannot start a production process today at a low level of scale and then expect to compete favorably with others who have been producing for decades and who have built capacity to a point where their, if you like, marginal cost of production has been reduced to a level that you cannot even hope to reach. And I think it is only when we understand this and when we agree that government must work with the private sector to create the necessary incentives and the necessary environment for investments to be made and to be nurtured and to be scaled up. Now, three things. You must generate the capacity to make the investment. You must motivate people to make the investment. When they make the investments, you must nurture them. You cannot expect somebody who invests in a cement plant today to be competitive with a company that has been producing cement for 100 years. So you must nurture the new investor to grow. And you must also encourage the private sector to grow. Truly, we have had cement mills for, I don't know, almost 100 years in Nigeria, but they were not encouraged to grow. And therefore they remain small scale. And therefore they focus only on the local market. And it is only when this new environment was created and the capacity to grow rapidly was motivated that we now begin to see us producing at the scale that enables us to compete globally. And I am absolutely certain that if we look at other areas, especially in our food processing area, in our dairy sector, we will see opportunities where government and the private sector working together can indeed agree on a strategy that will enable us to create the necessary capacity, to grow that capacity and to nurture it to a competitive level. I think this is perhaps the key to exploring the industrial capacity that Nigeria has. And we have tremendous capacity to do that. And this is particularly so now with this African Continental Free Trade Agreement coming up, because now the market is not just the Nigerian market. The market is in the entire African market, 1.2 billion people. And Nigeria still has a huge advantage if only we can create and sustain the necessary policies to take advantage of this market. But we must recognize that there are costs that have to be accepted. There are also basic investments that have been made in other sectors, like in infrastructure. And to a large extent, those investments largely will also have to be undertaken jointly by both government and the private sector. Where the private sector has the capacity to invest and to drive profitability, we should leave that to the private sector. Where, for obvious reasons, investment has to be long-term and the capital for long-term investment is not available within the private sector, government must take the necessary steps to make those investments, especially, for instance, in areas like transport infrastructure. Our ports, yes, you said there has been some development in the port, but please, for over 40 years, we have not had any significant expansion of our port system. If anything, some of the ports that could have been developed, like the Calabar port, Warri port, have actually deteriorated to a level where they are no longer in existence, more or less. So clearly, we need a new industrial policy that
Is it me alone? It's on. Okay. Okay. I think we have a network problem with Engineer Mansour. While he is coming back on, let me, in fact, shape the next question or issue around what he's been speaking to. One of the last words he used was industrial policy. Now we have approaches to how we build competitiveness and how industrial policy supports that. If we go back to the point that Engineer Mansour made about how local processing was at the heart of the development of industrial estates like Bompai in Kano. Indeed, I often talk about how Kakuri in Kaduna, Transamadi in Port Harcourt, and Aba and Ikeja became part of the industrial or manufacturing hubs of our country as the politicians tried to compete in rapidly industrializing Nigeria after independence. But what seems to have gotten in the way of a number of things was a philosophy, I think, that came largely out of LSE, the London School of Economics, and the influence of a scholar called Harold Lasky. I mean, this influence was significant on some of our early permanent secretaries. And so one of the views they advanced as Nigeria began to earn more money from crude oil was that government should occupy the commanding heights of the economy. One of the consequences, of this commanding heights philosophy was that government began to establish manufacturing facilities in many places. As Engineer Mansour said, part of the effect was a crowding out of that early development in private sector manufacturing. We have seen the challenges with that approach. We have seen import substitution suffer. But we have competing ways of looking at industrial policy. There's a South Korean at Cambridge called Jeju Chang, who has written a very interesting book titled Bad Samaritans. And he argues very stoutly for industrial policy and giving the room to local industry to grow behind barriers. There's a contesting perspective, generally aligned with a Chinese economist who spent a little time at the World Bank as his chief economist, Austin Lin. Professor Lin essentially argues for industrial policy to be targeted in certain areas of factor endowments in which support is given for the private sector or whoever to grow. We have been joined by an outstanding gentleman who I introduced earlier, Chief Kola Jamodu, former president of MAN, chief executive of a huge manufacturing enterprise in Nigeria, former chairman of the board of other manufacturing ventures, and former minister of industries. I had actually mentioned that I had the good fortune of being in his company on a trip to Malaysia Dr. Kandi Yumkela. So let us turn to Chief Jamodu and say, of these challenges to how we can grow manufacturing, in which a role maybe exists for the public sector and for the manufacturing sector, how should this partnership be built to be able to have a stout manufacturing sector that is competitive globally? Chief Jamodu. Please unmute. We can't hear you. Please unmute yourself. We still are not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Hello?
Thank you. Welcome.
Is it better now?
Very clear. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you
We can
very
hear you
much.
clearly.
A few problems in joining. That's one of our problems in the country. We spend quite some money getting the power in, but we haven't quite succeeded. But we're going to get there. We will get there. No doubt about that.
Yes.
I believe in it, and we'll get there. And thank you very much indeed. If I get you right, you were saying that I've had. Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, it's better.
Can hear you.
Okay. Yes, that's fine. That's better. I'm trying to improvise my system here. Thank you very much. And I'm quite happy to be at this discussion. We've been looking forward to this opportunity for quite some long time. And I want to appreciate you once again for your interest in seeing that things, move towards, really developing manufacturing business in the country. I've listened towards the tail end, unfortunately, to the contribution of Engineer Mansour Mohammed, and I must say I basically agree with him, what Charlie said. However, let me now come into it. You said rightly that there was a time in this country that, one head of state was, a problem was not with money. The problem was how to spend the money. And of course, the developed world then got this opportunity and started, helping also spend it. And they got to a point really that where we were importing everything, even including toothpick. But, thank goodness a stop has now been put into this. You are talking about public-private partnership. It's quite a while we've been talking about this victim. PPP. There is no way we will move except we jointly face this problem. It's a national problem, whether you're in government or in private sector. Our policies must be such that support investment, both local and foreign. Foreign should be to the extent that they don't come to take over what we can do locally. Policies have been put in place in the past, to solve, these seeming challenges. But any policy we are putting in place must give recognition to areas where we have natural competitive advantage. For example, now, somebody spoke about cement. Cement basically is nothing but limestone. Don't forget when we put together this policy during the days, I was on seat and with President Obasanjo. Limestone is spread all over strategic places in Nigeria. We have in Kogi, we have in somewhere in Kano, we have somewhere in Ogun State and the like. And there is no, we all agree that time that we don't bring in cement, let's say limestone, and call it cement. Policies were put in place. The manufacturers and people are genuinely interested in saying that we go into this, we're involved. And look, like you said, look at where we are today. We're now a next exporter. Question of pricing and the like, we've been talking about it. I think that can be resolved. And I think it will be resolved. I mean, it will not be an opportunity for us now to reverse that situation. We shouldn't. We should go ahead, give all the support necessary to make sure that we remain competitive based again. The big areas, apart from cement, policies were also put in place to ensure that we became locally sufficient in all the areas where we have the comparative competitive advantage, i.e., there is no point importing biscuits. We can convert the material which is nothing but wheat. And instead of exporting jobs and importing poverty, because for every item we import, we're importing poverty and exporting jobs. The only way the PP has recognized it's a question of how to do it. It's a question of getting all stakeholders involved is in ensuring that we put in policies and sustain policies that will help us reduce the number of our youth, not even youth, even elders, roaming all over the streets looking for jobs. Create jobs locally, stop importing jobs and exporting
raw
jobs.
materials.
A number of areas, the policy was put in place. Develop cocoa, which we did. And then to ensure that the manufacturing sector gets involved, this was started. But we must know too that the developed policies, developed world are watching. There was a time when the export price you can get for cocoa is not commensurate with the local value addition you've given to it. The more processed local addition you've given to cocoa, which is providing jobs for Nigerians, the less export price you're going to get for it until, the manufacturer association will step into this and discussion is still on. To my mind, and like I've always said to Pat and in all policies, we should re-examine that which we have right now. The policies which I'm sure government are doing, everybody's, all stakeholders are doing it. That which, number one, which help us to reduce dependency on importation and generating interest in ensuring that there is encouragement to the manufacturers to processed locally. And I give you an example what was done some time ago. That was from 20, came in. Just before the handover from the military to civilians, some policies were such that require a lot of re-examination. And the civilian government came in and put together both private sector, public sector, to examine those areas. One of them was duty, customs duty. There was a time in this country that when the manufacturers were paying as high as 33% to 40% customs duty on plant and machinery that is not produced in this country and will not be economically viable to be produced because of the volume. When this anomaly was brought into discussion, we all saw it. Policies immediately were put in place to correct this. How was this done? Duty on machinery was reduced from 40% to as low as 5%. And this encouraged manufacturers to be able to sustain their capacities, or in fact, import more machinery to expand production. And not only that, duty on imported finished goods that were being produced in this country was reduced. Of course, all these were realigned. We examined all the duty that was being paid on items that can be locally produced, and put in policies, and in fact come with a customs tariff, that is heavily, akin to local production. We can go on and on and on. There's no reason why we cannot do a bit more about that. Local value addition is key. Policies in place to sustain, for the sustainability of these policies are very, very keen, and I think we should do. Yes.
NHS.
Hello? Hello?
Thank you. I think that
Thank you.
those issues around tariffs and all of that piggyback onto the kind of industrial policy that we'd like to pursue. You have made a point that Engineer Ahmed also made about factor endowments, the endowments that we have around which we should build our competitiveness. In previous episodes, I've spoken to some leaders in manufacturing who gave examples of progress that was being made before policies changed. For example, in one of the episodes, Mr. Felix Ohiwere talked about when government had made the policy about using local inputs as against malted barley. How he went to the Netherlands and said to the Heineken people, we need to be able to use local material without any significant change in taste to be able to keep our customers. And they said this would be very difficult. But when they saw that he was very serious, they committed to the process. And Nigerian Breweries was able to achieve that significantly. And just as they were achieving it, policy changed. We also have effort made to create a raw materials research and development council to identify those factor endowments, where they exist, and how to exploit them for value chains in manufacturing. In the last episode, we had Dr. Remy Aribisala focusing on that fairly significantly.
Hello? Okay.
Okay, Chief Jamadu, are you going to say something?
No, I was going to say that I've lost you
towards the
tail end, if you don't mind. Yes.
Okay. So,
yes.
I want to return to Engineer Ahmed to ask.
No, you were talking about. One point. Let me make a comment about this. I think we should, as a country, be very, very mindful about development of policies internationally, especially the industrial world. When you talk of EPA, for example, it's an area which arrested and contained the attention of manufacturers for quite a while. We were talking of EPA, ECOWAS, clear definition of simple things like country of origin, minimum contribution in the country of manufacture, the country of origin of the manufacturer, should be maintained before the benefits could be enjoyed. Rather. It's been a problem. Then we've now moved it to EPA, to the latest one, which sure we're keeping a very, very close eye, because there is no reason why Nigeria should not benefit from the free trade, the Africa free trade zone agreement. But one thing again we must always mention is that Nigeria is the largest market in the Black Africa, with very, very rich and promising, the strength to be able to participate. So the country, the rule of I think it's an area which you try and hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. The minimum, I think I'm just trying to get the exact definition of that. There is what you call the source of
country of origin.
That's right. It's the country of origin. Country of origin. It's been abused left and right at the ECOWAS level. And again, we try our best, look at chicken, look at the way it comes in, look at the rice, with all the policies we put in place. There are things which the measures must continue to be put in place in order to safeguard local manufacturers. I thought I should just mention this point. Yeah.
Thank you. It's important because that's part of the agglomeration of issues around the question I was about to raise, which is to say,
okay,
we have competition within and without, but there are ways we can reach accommodation that will facilitate our own development. If you look at the way the Asians rose as manufacturers, they faced the international market. Of course, the international market was not necessarily looking forward to new competitors, but they also saw advantage in manufacturing in Asia, which helped boost manufacturing in Asia, with most of those manufactured goods coming back to the Western economies. Now, the question is, what are the strategies that can best help us achieve both collaboration and competitiveness, even with those Western interests? When Kande Yumkela joins us, I'm going to raise this issue, particularly related to textiles and how the textile industry died in Nigeria when it could have become competitive in a certain linkage with a number of global dominant players in the apparel industry. But let's keep that for Kande when it comes. I want to say, talking generally around this issue, if you look at the NLNG strategy, it seems to have become perhaps the best model of government and private sector internationally, locally, kind of working together. Engineer Ahmed, in the place of the commanding heights strategy, could we or should we look more at the NLNG kind of strategy? Are you an old NNPC person? What are the lessons that we can take from that strategy?
And I'm sorry I was cut off earlier on. My system just collapsed on me. I had to change.
That's trouble. Yes.
Anyway,
it happens in the system.
First of all, let us look at our investment policy and investment strategy. The LNG, I think, is a clear example of how to structure investment, which allows foreign investors to come in, but ensures that, first of all, the benefit of the investment is, in most respects, local. The LNG system, first of all, creates a platform where, first of all, stable policy arrangement is made, because it was based on an agreement which was signed by both parties. And that agreement provided, first of all, that the investment that's made, the revenues generated will be reinvested until the project grows to a point where it becomes fully self-sustaining. And the partners, NNPC and the foreign partners, did not have to inject any moment. If you is reinjection of the revenues from the investment. So that is one aspect of the investment policy, but it also has to be sustained for long enough to mature. Secondly, I think one of the benefits of the LNG arrangement is the decision-making process itself. As you are aware, the key downside of public sector management of the way public sector operates is that decision-making becomes tenuous, unreliable, and certainly unpredictable. And no real business operation can succeed under those decision-making terms. So again, if we are now talking about large-scale investment where government has to put in significant amount of money, and particularly with regards to LNG, where we are using a basic domestic resource that obviously is significantly controlled. But I think part of it can also be extended to investment in other sectors. For instance, in terms of major infrastructure investments, particularly for ports. There's no reason why we cannot adopt the same kind of arrangement as LNG investment. Ensure that, first of all, the operation is run commercially. Government investment, government participation is through the board and no other structures. The minister cannot come and cancel a decision that has already been taken by the board. So you allow the enterprise to run as a purely private sector enterprise, making its own investment, making its own decisions, and ensuring that the environment is stable enough for those decisions to mature. Now, that I think is at the higher level. But I think we must also look at investment policies at the lower level, which should seek to do three things. First of all, to minimize the time frame for investors to come in and actually move from initial investment decision-making to actual commissioning and operation. Because of our regulations, and sometimes it takes too long for an investor to actually move through that stage. So we must cut down on all the administrative procedures and regulations that tend to extend that time. Secondly, I think government should consider and think of the benefits, its revenues should come not from the investment stage, but from the operation stage. So all charges and costs that are due to government in the process of creating investment should actually be reduced to an absolute minimum. Let the benefit, let the revenues come after the investment is operated. It should come from the investment, not from the investor. So that's the second part. The third is, again, as I said, when we are anticipating particularly in pricing decision, if that investor comes in who is getting input the same product from a producer whose costs have already been completely covered. So we are competing with marginal costs of people who are producing at a very large scale. So our pricing decisions and our laws and regulations regarding this, and including taxation and all sorts of levies and charges, must be geared to allow the investor to move through the scale effect, to build the scale and to build the quality and specific capacity to compete before we begin to charge those things back. And I think this brings us to the issues that Chief Jamodu raised, that our custom duties, to me, custom and such regulatory agencies should be seen as enablers for economic activity, not gatekeepers and revenue collectors. If we allow investments to come and grow over a period of time, what the government can get from direct taxation, it makes up for all the expected losses in terms of custom duty, net paid, et cetera, et cetera. We should put custom duty on finished product imports, because what they are paying in that context is paying the local costs that have been absorbed by the investor at home. So I believe that these are some of the issues that we need to look at in setting up new investment policies as well as industrial policies. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I would like to follow up on that.
Can I?
Okay, Chief Jamodu, yeah, okay.
I think when you are following up, I just wanted to chip in something. When we say government should put in policy, it's welcome. Governments and successive governments have made an attempt to do this. Look at the one spot, what is supposed to be a one-stop
shop
approval. The Nigeria Investment Promotion Council. So you go there, you see all the rules, everything are there, manufacturers were involved, Rebel was involved. You go there, and within days, you get your certificate of commencement of business. and the regulations are there. You have problems, you go there, you sort it out. They go to the necessary arms of government and get the answer for you. That was the whole idea. I think it's high time we look at that. Why is it that it's not working? The NIPC, it will have solved quite a number of these things.
Chief, if I can
the other point. Yes.
Yes, please, Engineer Ahmed.
Yes.
I wanted to say that, you see, the problem is that we make too many rules, and then we want to now put all the rules together and say we want a one-stop shop. The idea, in my view, if we want to encourage investors, reduce the rules to the minimum.
Absolutely.
I mean, look, there are some, if you look at some of the investment rules, you can reduce the rules by most probably 60% and still be able to create the regulation necessary to safeguard the local investment. For instance, in my view, with regard to import of things, what you want to ensure is that, first of all, you avoid importation of harmful goods, right? Secondly, you ensure that quality of what is being imported is acceptable. And thirdly, you also ensure that you do not allow importers to use the importation to transfer funds abroad unnecessarily. If you can focus on the minimum rules, then it will be easier for investors to come in and do business. You know? And I believe that if we compare our environment with the environments elsewhere, we find that this is exactly what is happening. Whereas in some areas, the rules are just few and minimal. And then, of course, the process of complying with those rules also needs to be easy. And that is when the one-stop shop kind of arrangement comes in. But our one-stop shop doesn't work for two reasons. Because the NIPC one-stop shop does not remove the process of getting approvals, going through a whole range of steps through the ministries. The guy at the NIPC one-stop shop simply represents the point at which you engage the ministry, but the processes still go on. And I think the idea is to reduce those processes to the minimum. Thank you.
I think we are saying exactly the same thing, Mansour. The point that the intention, if I remember, was to stop people going to all the ministries and getting approval. Get the one point. If it's, because there's no point having an IPC when you still have to go all over the place. It's either the place is not sufficiently empowered. If it's not sufficiently empowered, then we should go to these places. It's all question of examining it. And what I wanted to say really is that there seem to me there are a lot of policies or whatever, regulations, like Engineer Mansour said, maybe there are too many or whatever. Why are they not working? Don't forget, one of the economics somewhere, the slogan that year is, why are these not working? You know, we just list all of them, call people, why are they not working? I think it's a worthwhile thing to look at, and perhaps it may help us. It would definitely assist.
Okay. Yes, it leads me to a very important part of this conversation. What is perhaps needed, and Engineer Mansour Ahmed makes this point brilliantly, in my opinion, when he talks about where the emphasis should be. I think that what has happened is that we have structured bureaucracy in a way that the mind's focus is on control more than the bigger picture. With that mindset, you get customs, you get all the, so focused on enforcement that somebody doesn't ask the question, to achieve what? In the United States, this is a point I repeat fairly frequently. You have, in the American Midwest that I know, something called TIFA funds. TIFA is Tax Incentives Finance Authority. the purpose of TIFA funds is to encourage investments so that local governments competing with each other for location of businesses can go as far as actually giving grants to a business coming into their neighborhood, providing bank guarantees to that business based on a calculation of the fact that if this business locates here, it's going to attract X satellite businesses. And in 10 years or 15 or 20, this amount of tax revenues are going to be flowing out of this area. So the local government takes the risk of putting in his money, not of not getting revenue, doesn't think revenue at that point, but knows that in 20 years, it's going to get a tremendous flow of tax revenues from that area. But it seems that in the mindset of our public service, that the emphasis is in the gatekeeping function, the revenue you can collect today, and forgetting that because of that revenue and the way you go about it, there might be no revenue in the future, and so on and so forth. What are the things, and that was one of the primary purposes of the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, to try and achieve this mindset change. It would have to involve a tripartite engagement of the private sector, the social enterprise sector, and the public sector. Has the NESG sufficiently affected things in that direction? What can be done to facilitate this mindset change so that we can achieve growth in manufacturing, which is critical to providing jobs for the millions of young people in this our youth bulge, a country that's about to become the third most populous country in the world, should be obsessively focused on how to create jobs for those people who are going to be born in a few short years, and taking an approach to industrialization that can do what China did is a very important thing for us. So what do you think we should be doing to achieve this mindset change on the side of policymakers and the public bureaucracy? Please.
Well,
yes.
Thank you, Prof. I think, yes, many people seem to think that the NESG, although it has been talking at the top of its voice on these issues for almost 26, 27 years, may not have achieved as much as was expected or as people assume it should. But I believe it has made a lot of difference over the years. A lot of the policies that today seem to work are actually policies initiated or at least introduced through the NLD process. For instance, if you look at our pension, I think that was one classical policy that has worked and has remained stable. If you look at the port changes, the privatization, if we had not privatized the ports, where we are today, we are not happy, but believe me, we would have been in desperate situation. Imagine, for instance, the level of investment that has been made by these port concessionaires. I'm not sure that if the ports had been in the hands of government, would have made half of that or even 1/10 of that investment. But perhaps it's not enough. And one of the reasons is perhaps what you said, the mindset of the public sector, particularly the enforcement and control mindset. We said, why do policies not work? Because we're, first of all, too many institutions competing with each other to make the policies not work. You go to the port, you have the customs, you have the, what do you call it? The
NAFDAC, Navy.
And all these people each and every institution believes that they have to do their work, right? And in my view, if the system is to work, we must harmonize and consolidate that regulatory practice so that there are not too many people interfering with the process of importation or exportation. So, but you know, when we try to harmonize the various agencies through there was a commission that tried to look at the large number of federal government agencies and try to harmonize. But as far as I know, despite several attempts by different governments, nothing like that has happened. So I believe
why
that
this resistance to getting these things done? I mean, you gave the example of the ports and
yes,
concessioning and all of that. I had the privilege of actually leading the team for the commercialization of the Nigerian Ports Authority.
yes,
Chief Sam Asabia was supposed to, and he basically considered that I lead that team back in the 80s. And the idea of concessioning and moving to a landlord port structure, we recommended as far a long time ago as 1990.
yes.
But they resisted it. And we crawled and crawled until many years after. And we you know, how do we teach the public servant that it is ultimately in his own long-term best self-interest that these kinds of things should happen?
Well, I think there are two key issues, Prof. First of all, I think our governance process, our political process itself, this idea of discrete operations of various aspects of governance, it starts from there. People feel that their responsibility is insulated from other responsibilities. And often, as a result of that, they're actually, in many respects, in conflict with each other. When you say, for instance, look, the SAN and Custom and NAVDAC and NDLA and so on should organize themselves so that there will be only one office where all those regulations will be complied with. How can that happen? I would not allow Custom to do my work. NDLA will say, I will not, Custom cannot do my work. Custom says, SAN will not do my work. So I think, first of all, we must to start with looking at the governance as itself and the purpose of regulation. And I think we must remove two things. We must remove the issue of revenue generating responsibility from regulating processes and activities, particularly economic activities. If, for instance, Custom will just limit to regulating the process, and the custom fee is collected by some agency on which the custom people have no direct impact, they will probably be more effective in regulating the import-export process than if they are now having to collect revenue themselves. And I believe that there is still need to look at these public sector regulatory processes and find a way, first of all, to identify in each case, what is the purpose? And align those regulations that have basically a common purpose and have one agency producing and just focusing on the purpose. If, for instance, the idea is for us to facilitate trade through import and export, the measure by which you assess the effectiveness of this custom should be to what extent have they facilitated trade? To what extent have they facilitated export and import? Not how much have they collected in the process. So I think there's a whole lot of review and re-engineering that is absolutely essential in order to have structures in place that will support policies that will encourage and speed up economic growth. Now, in terms of the polity itself, again, I think we go back to the idea of the responsibility, if you like, economic responsibility of a governance is the overall growth and health of the economy. And so we must begin to look at what measures do we actually assess to confirm, to assess the extent to which government is discharging these responsibilities. So the whole concept of looking at aspects of governance and assessing what the purpose is will enable us to define how should that purpose be best achieved, and therefore how should we structure the system so that we can achieve that purpose.
Well, thank you. It's such an important area if we are going to debottleneck systems. And I like maybe the benefit of Chim Jamodu's experience here, because there are many people who say that the biggest risk in developing enterprise in Nigeria is regulatory risk. That is worse than market risk and whatever else. How are we going to reduce regulatory risk? Right, Chief?
Yes, thank you very much. I think I accept. But how are we going to reduce regulatory risk? I think the way I look, don't forget, not too long ago, too, an attempt was made by the manufacturing sector, private sector, everybody, to take a deep dive into this. Rather than have about 8, I don't know whether 8 or 9, 10 regulators sitting at the customs, slowing down the process of exporting or slowing down the process of importing raw materials into this country. Why don't you just empower them to exchange views and come out with what should be done and what should not be done, rather than, going to make an attempt to do, force things to be done at the port, to regulate this. But the way I look at it really is that it will get to a point, like we've done before, where policies should be put in place that protects local manufacturers. Local manufacturers, and the only thing this can be done is via import duty. You can't say people should not import if they have the money for it and they have the forex for it. Don't forget too, there was a point where use of local and currency of the government was not to be allowed. You can't bring it in today. Vegetable oil should, although it's still coming in. Chicken, because there's chicken all over the place. You cannot, because it's locally grown, and likely, we have all the farmers, and it's going to encourage our agricultural sector, which we are all, it's a ready avenue, for employment. There is a lot of double tracking. You have the standard organization, we have the NAFDAC, we have the agency trying to make room for itself and trying to the sustainability then depends on what they earn from their operation, and that creates a bit of problems which a number of organizations, and it's affecting, quite a lot of people.
Yes. Well, thank you, Chief.
Yes.
One of the things that I am hoping for is that we can develop a system for incentivizing public sector agencies to prosper from things being done.
I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm not hearing. Hello? I've lost you again. Hello?
Yeah, I didn't realize I had become muted, so I needed to unmute myself. Sorry.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so I was saying that one of the challenges that I am almost obsessed with is how to get a system of incentives that can make the public service actually profit more from doing something with a higher order goal than they may or may not be profiting from the way they are doing things presently. Incentives, rather than just badging, hitting them in the head, accusing them of this or that. How can we structure incentives so that they see a greater gain? They actually get more. Maybe if more factories produce more, the agency responsible for, I don't know, whatever, they should get higher salaries or whatever. I don't know. I need to come up with a system of incentives that can make. Yes, Engineer Ahmed.
Yeah, Prof,
Yes.
I think this goes back to the point I made, that I think we need to go back to the purpose of specific public sector agencies.
Right.
And define what is the higher purpose for which they're set up, and align their incentives to those higher purposes. If, for instance, as I said before, if the custom system is intended to encourage trade through export and export, can we assess the effectiveness of custom by the extent which trade has improved every year, export has improved, import has reduced over there, and then reward them on that basis, rather than by the extent which they have collected revenue from exporters and importers, which essentially they do by tightening up the import-export processes. If you go back to the higher order, you will find that they are going to be more likely to encourage import and export. Of course, you have to put other structures around to ensure that this is done responsibly. The same thing with SON. If SON is that the purpose of the Standard Organization Nigeria is to ensure that the standard of products being exported or being imported has continued to increase from year to year, and you reward the SON management by the extent to which we have seen an improvement in that, then I think you will find that the incentive system will change. And I think this is basically what happens in the private sector. You identify
thank you very much.
What is the goal of a particular arm of the private sector.
Right.
If it is in the marketing sector, how much has our market improved over the years? And you pay them on the basis of that. Your accountant, you pay him on the basis of the effectiveness of the accounting.
So
let me just put you. Let me go ahead.
All right. Yes.
I have to go in about 10 minutes, if you don't mind. I'm sorry, brother.
But
just one point I thought I would make, which will help us. The entire portfolio of incentives, policies, and the like must be put together and translated into a budget and see the effect on the global budget we're going to put together. Let me tell you one thing. We're saying importation has to be reduced. Customs duty and the revenue from whatever DFC is charged. And before, I don't know whether it's still the same, and it's a percentage of this revenue that is used to fund.
I'm going to call for Keshi.
Hello? Hello?
Go ahead, Chief.
That is used to fund their operations. In between, so really, then the budget for customs must take this into account, that invariably the revenue they are going to collect must be reduced because the quantity of importation is being reduced. That's one. Number two, profits. This can be translated into profit if that during that process, the local manufacturer then gets more profit or whatever revenue on which government profit tax is based. So there'll be a reduction in customs duty and increase from the federal inland revenue. So the total, because both of them are governments, whether you are inland numbers, there's going to be plus in one and minus in the other. This is the idea that is causing a bit of problem. Duty, because the duty is being charged, duty is just to make sure it gets duty. The federal revenue, because the organizations are not doing quite as well in the interim, they may not be able to deliver, what's been budgeted as the profit tax, for that particular year that we generated. These are some of the points which I've been thinking about.
Right.
Yes.
Well, thank you. We have a number of participants who are raising their hands. One of them is Ambassador Joe Keshi. So, like us to get Ambassador Keshi's comments or question. Unmute yourself, Ambassador Keshi. Okay. Yeah, I would say that. Aha.
Good evening, Professor Tony and Chief Jamodu. Nice to see you, and Ahmed. Nice to see you all, and then to listen to what you have said. I just wanted to react to just part of what you just finished discussing with regard to the question you asked about the involvement of the bureaucrats in the activities of the Nigerian Economic Summit, and whether it's my own experience. I just wanted to say that I'm not too sure the summit itself has adequately engaged the bureaucrats enough. I can give you a series of examples. I have attended a couple of the Nigerian Economic Summits in Abuja, and I remember that anytime I attend, particularly when I was PAMSEC, in the presidency, I'm not too sure I see more than 2 or 3 or 4 permanent secretaries and directors, and these are just from the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning, that are the key organizers. Collaborators with the private sector. So the point I'm trying to make is that I think there's a need to properly engage the bureaucrats themselves. There's a need to expand, interaction, not just with the ministers who serve for a period and leave, but with the permanent secretaries and the directors who eventually are the implementers of the policies that are being put in place, or will, at the end of the day, raise, memos for some of these policies to be enacted. So I just thought that I make this point because it's very crucial. Then the second thing is that I remember the first time that I had to apply, to attend the summit. Actually, my late boss then queried me that, why am I going to spend 100,000 to go to this event here in Abuja? Why are they not allowing these civil servants to attend free? And I think there's a case that should be made for, in that sense, because at the end of the day, if it was intended for 2 or 3 partners, and one major partner is not in the room, it's certainly not going to achieve the overall result that it was intended to. So I just thought I'd make that point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
I would like to comment on that comment by Ambassador Keshi.
Go ahead, please.
I think it's a very valid point, but perhaps is not fully informed. First of all, you're absolutely right. Indeed, the summit would have been a lot more effective if there's more participation of the public sector operators, especially permanent secretaries and directors. Now, why are they not at the main summit, the annual summit? It's largely a question really of the decision of the ministries not to incur the cost. Now, the summit costs a lot of money, and the private sector does in fact pay its fee, its full cost, but the cost of the public sector has to be shared, and it's not always possible to make it open and free. I believe many actually are invited free, but often the ministries do not see the justification to pay for that, even though they themselves will organize perhaps functions that are of less importance and pay even more money. However, I believe the summit itself is aware of this. I remember when I ran the summit between 2003 and 2008, we actually set up what we call policy commissions. And the idea of the policy commissions is that they actually constitute platforms in different subsectors, each platform engaging the relevant ministries and directors of the public sector. And it is from these policy commissions that the issues that are to be discussed at the summit are raised. And after the summit, it is through these commissions that they are supposed to be further drilled down and pushed forward for execution. However, I believe, again, the way government works is often in the way. The processes of putting together policies, crafting policies, does require a lot more work than is currently being done. I don't know whether it is lack of capacity in some public sector agencies or maybe cost issues. But I think if the summit will also expand and strengthen these policy commissions, and if they are brought up in terms of the caliber of participants, because sometimes the permanent secretaries ask the director to attend, the director asks the assistant director to attend, and it goes down until the capacity to actually interact effectively is lost. So there's a lot that needs to be done to improve the summit process. I agree. But I still believe that the summit process is important for our policy-making processes. I used to say that, well, you say all this talk has not taken us anywhere. I wonder where would have been if the talk has not taken place at all. We'll probably be way back. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a number of things that we have struggled to do through the years around this matter, because it is so important. About 20-something or so years ago, I actually pushed for development of a program at the Lagos Business School that we call Making Markets Work. The idea was to bring together people at the level of directors, maybe permanent secretaries, but more directors in the service, private sector chief executives, perhaps some leaders of civil society in one class, and keep them together for several weeks, just taking on the issues that relate to an enabling environment for a competitive economy. For a variety of reasons, and I was developing this program with a lady at the Harvard Business School, who was a professor. and she was shortly after that appointed president of one of the women's colleges, one of the schools in the North England, New England states, and somehow that fell through. But we actually offered a number of scholarships to come to the chief executive program at that time to some members of the National Assembly and some PAMSECs. Only one person took it up in full through. Is a gentleman called Nze Chididuru. His other colleagues came once, twice, stopped attending. I don't think any permanent secretary showed up. There's really, in my view, a need to find ways of making these three sectors realize. I mean, you go to, when I went with Chief Jamodu and Kola Jamodu, Ambassador Keshi, your countryman, because you know we donated you to Sierra Leone a long time ago. Your countryman, Kande Yumkela, supposed to join us, but the vice president died and is at the funeral.
Oh,
He's still trying to join us.
hello?
But one of the conversations during that visit to Malaysia took place with the then head of the Manufacturing Association. I think it was called CBI, CMI, Confederation of Malaysian Industry. A retired general who ran a tire business. And the point that he made in that conversation about the nature of the robust engagement between them and the public servants, I think it's telling about a big lacuna in our system that does not allow us to develop policy in the interest of the growth of the Nigerian economy. But let's take a question from Ajayi Olakunle, and then after that, CJ Agu. Mr. Olakunle. Mr. Olakunle is not there. It's Mr. Agu or Agu.
Can I?
Yes, Chief Jamodu.
Do you mind if I crave your indulgence? Like I said, can I chicken out while I join?
No, you're not chickening out, but you can go on to the next assignment. We appreciate the time that you have spent with us.
Thank you.
And we'll keep the interaction going.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm quite happy to have participated. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll do that. Thank you.
Great.
Very good.
Okay, CJ, please go ahead.
All right, thank you so much,
please.
One of the measures I noticed that have worked beautifully well in other climes, as I've mentioned by the various speakers, is not policy, it's not regulation, but measures to incentivize and encourage manufacturing. And I remember back in the days, we had the technology incubation centers for small-scale manufacturers. We had industrial and manufacturing zones. But all of a sudden, these measures seem to have collapsed. So what are the challenges? How can we go back to the drawing board and encourage manufacturing sector with these so-called technology incubation centers, manufacturing zones, export processing zones, where manufacturers can actually be given the needed aid for them to set up, manufacture, and produce in this country? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Okay. One of the challenges that we have had in Nigeria is how those incubators were managed. Again, it's part of the nature of public service. I mentioned in one of the earlier episodes being on a flight to somewhere with another Sierra Leonean who was also in the UNDP system. Babashola Chinsman was the head of UNDP, I believe, in Nigeria at the time. And he was complaining about how those incubators developed. I think he was making the point that the very first one in Nigeria and the first one in China were set up literally on the same day. And that while Nigeria was still at 1, China went past 100. Public sector had a critical play in why that did not grow, in my opinion, from what I've heard. The one in Oshodi, as it more or less turned out, it became another agency through which the usual happened, and power trumped purpose, and we didn't get the effect. But we now need to recognize how critical it is for this economy to rebuild manufacturing. And all the ideas that need to be put on the front burner to accelerate the pace of SME growth to support bigger industry, I think needs to come to play now. And perhaps by way of a closing question to Engineer Mansour Ahmed, as we've not managed to see Yunkela, looks like the funeral has gone longer than he programmed. What can be done? I mean, I asked in a previous episode about, the Dangote Group collaborating with the German GTZ Agency for Human Capital Development. What can be done by major manufacturers to stimulate creating those incubators, knowing that no major manufacturers can be effective without a supply network of SME manufacturers? How should we try and develop this network as part of a general national strategy for developing manufacturing?
Yes, Prof. I think there is need. By the way, it's already starting, but I think there are 3 things that we must do. First of all, I believe more effort should be made in engaging manufacturers. For instance, when we're trying to develop the sugar industry, we brought the key sugar manufacturers and said, look, let the government and the sugar manufacturers work together and set up a platform to grow the industry through the National Sugar Council, Sugar Development Council. I think we need to do more of that. In this context, the manufacturers have a role to play. They should, and not necessarily just grant money, but they should invest in line with the agreed policy and subject to incentives that should be agreed with clear timelines, which has happened, for instance, which is happening in the sugar sector. I believe that we need to go in each other of these other sectors to do the same. Recently, I'm aware that the government is engaging the major dairy producers to say, look, how do we backward target? How do we grow our dairy industry by developing the backward side? And I'm aware that effort is being made in this regard. with some of the key manufacturers in partnership. However, there are three things that government, first of all, and the willingness to agree that this thing should be taken through its paces. You cannot have a successful growth if after the first 2 or 3 years people have invested money, you change the rules, you change the law, and the whole thing collapses. It actually discourages any further attempt by manufacturers to do so. Secondly, I think we must recognize, as I said before, that when custom duty waivers and so on, it needs to be negotiated and agreed on the basis of the timelines, and on time. We must see cement production growing on a year-on-year basis. We can do the same thing with sugar. We can do the same thing with, for instance, other agri-based projects. We can do the same thing with some pharmaceutical projects. For instance, I have no reason to believe that today the capacity we're just playing with it. There's tremendous capacity, but we need to bring those who are investing in that sector and sit with them and agree on a framework over a period of time. And both government and the private sector must comply with those agreements, especially government, in the sense that you do not change the rules midway. You do not encourage people to invest and then you go back. You know, this happened with tire manufacturers. I remember in the mid-80s, there was an arrangement to expand tire manufacturing. And I believe that the intention was to put a hold on importation of certain standard of tires. And Dunlop and Michelin were the key producers of tires at that time. And I remember Dunlop invested a huge amount to produce big tires, truck tires, because they were not available in the country. I think soon after, the government, I think Michelin anticipated a change of route and decided to hold on their investment and actually to expand their rubber processing, rubber plantations. They subsequently moved their production out of the country and started exporting rubber. Dunlop, on the other hand, expanded their manufacturing, and now exporting rubber. So that's the kind of arrangement that must be made. Agreement must be sustained over a sufficiently long enough period of time for the goals to be realized. Targets must be set both for the production process as well for the incentives that are given to support those production. The society sector also needs to contribute in this by monitoring these things and in specific sectors, and to be able to manage the process of growth. I think these are issues that really need to we need to put on the table. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you so very much. This is so important in our conversation with the pharmaceutical sector. I put it to a particular panel which had 3 former ministers of health. And I said, is it not possible to have a kind of sector council of elders, that when a new government comes in and some new minister actively sabotages, not because the person is bad, and because there is no institutional memory, others of the sector, if you want to call it that, bring their collective, look, this is the consequence of where you are going. These are the challenges, these are the problems we have faced. And perhaps things may be different. That person we should respect. They agreed our policies had been literally, we should not have the same kind of orientation in manufacturing. Getting together to examine what is going wrong, what they need to say to an incumbent to prevent him from making a mistake that was made before. That can help us get manufacturing down a trajectory that can lead to true expansion, growth, and development in the sector. We will stay one more week with manufacturing and look at how the regional, the Dawn Commission, whether it is in the South or Breeze Commission has been called, or whether it is in what the old Northern Nigeria Development Corporation, see how factor endowments of the various regions can become the basis of new manufacturing hubs. Profound thanks to Engineer Mansour Ahmed, to Chief Kola Jamodu, and to all of us who have participated. And I think we probably will be able to talk back Dr. Kamde Yunkela, who, because of the sudden death of the Vice President in Sierra Leone, is caught up at this funeral, maybe to join us in the conversation a fortnight from today. Thank you all so very much, and have a great week.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for your leadership. And thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.